Okay, so let's talk about hazardous waste. I'm going to talk about several kind of important environmental laws, 3 of them, and that have to do with hazardous waste in one way or another. Before I do that, probably all of you have had a chemistry class at some point. Have you in high school or here? So you might recognize this image. It's the periodic table of elements. So all the substances that exist in the world and the universe, in theory, are made up of combinations of atoms that are coming from this periodic table. A lot of the things that we use in our modern society are based on carbon, which is so organic chemicals or chemicals that are made up of carbon. And a lot of the toxic chemicals, a disproportionate number, are organic chemicals that have been synthesized for some particular purpose. So when you arrange the atoms into different arrangements, you have a molecule. And depending on how things are arranged and what the atoms are, there'll be different sort of chemical properties. And some of those properties can be helpful, like drugs, pesticides, preservatives for food, polymers that are used to make everything in this room, like plastics. But they can also have harmful properties. Sometimes they can be corrosive, so they can eat away at biological tissue or metal. They can have toxic. They can harm the survival or the health of an organism. They can readily burn in a hazardous way. They can be explosive, things like that. So this guy, Famoso Dr. Paracelsus, is a 16th century alchemist. He has a really great name that's on the speaker's notes, but I can't see the speaker's notes. It's many names, but Bombastus is one of his middle names. So he was obviously he liked to talk and was a braggart or something. But in addition to being an alchemist, which is somebody who supposedly could turn lead into gold or something, he is considered the father of toxicology, which is the science of poisons. And his the short version of his quote is, "The dose makes the poison." So things that are potentially deadly at a high concentration may be perfectly safe at a low concentration. That's one of the problems with Proposition 65. They don't tell you what your dose is because they don't know necessarily. So there is something called a safe harbor level where they don't have to provide the warning, but there are a lot of, anyway, you get the point. So we really rely on toxic chemicals for beneficial functions like fighting cancer or keeping your swimming pool from getting cloudy or keeping fungus from growing in your food or something, killing weeds and insects, preserving medicines or foods, preventing transmission of COVID-19. There are all kinds of good benefits of toxic chemicals. So this is a slide that kind of illustrates some of the pitfalls that chemicals have. So this is one of my colleagues came up with this, and this has to do with a chemical called DDT. Has anybody heard of DDT? So it's an insecticide, really effective, but has some problems. So DDT was first prepared, and on the speaker's notes, the name of the chemist is there, but in 1873. And sometime later, in 1939, which was the year World War II was just getting underway in Europe, it was discovered that it was really effective at killing insects, and especially the mosquitoes that cause malaria. So in a lot of tropical climates in South and Central and South America, Asia, Africa, where the mosquitoes that transmit malaria are really endemic, it saves a lot of lives, millions of lives really, to apply this insecticide. And it really became widespread from the 40s to the 1960s. In 1962, a woman named Rachel Carson released a book called Silent Spring, which is a classic of sort of environmental literature. And it talks about Clear Lake. You may have been to Clear Lake, but among other things. But it's just how chemicals like DDT that are persistent build up over time and cause unforeseen effects on organisms like birds and wildlife. The bald eagle, our national bird, almost went extinct because DDT makes the shells really brittle so that the chicks die before they can hatch, for example. California condor, almost extinct, same reason. So, super useful chemical, save lives, and also cause a lot of problems. 1970s, there was a lot more awareness. That was when some of these laws I'm going to tell you about were enacted. PBT means persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. So there became more awareness of chemicals that had those properties. Persistent just means that it doesn't break down readily. It sticks around. When you release it, it kind of stays there, builds up. Bioaccumulative means that over time it can build up in the body, in either a person or in an animal. And toxic means it's harmful to the health or survival of the organism. So in the 1970s, DDT was banned in the United States due to a lot of these problems. It's still actually used in some parts of the world, but people are much more aware of the risks of using DDT. So when we're talking about hazardous waste, I think the big difference is when something is a product versus when something's a waste. So if you buy a container of bleach, or that's a bad example. Let's say an insecticide. You have roach spray or something. You buy a thing of roach spray. You pay money for it. You put it under the sink. You're using it periodically. You're likely to be much more careful with it than when you're like, I never use this stuff. I don't want this. Let's get rid of it. That's when things can go awry. That's when a lot of times there'll be a release. So people tend to be more careful with things that they value, that they want. So when something becomes a waste, the rules change because of the fact that, just by their nature, wastes are things people want to get rid of, and so they're likely to do something that's going to be potentially harmful. So hazardous waste could be a spent material. So a contaminated solvent, an example would be a cleaning solvent that's used, like let's say at an auto repair facility where they're degreasing parts. At some point it gets so cruddy and gunky that it's no longer useful for that. So at that point they just need to get rid of it. A byproduct might be something you produce while you're refining or doing an industrial process, and you generate the thing you want. Could be some metal ingots, let's say, that you're going to use to make something, and then there's some other crud that you don't want that slag and dross are generated in smelting. Sludges from industrial processes, like the stuff that settles out in a plating bath at a chrome plating shop. So that's not really, I'm not really talking about sewage sludge here, but off-specification products, it's like, I put a little too much, like maybe at the facility, somebody makes a mistake, they put a little too much of this, a little too much of that they can't sell it, it becomes waste. So there are also things that have just been sitting around for a long time. So the takeaway is the same stuff when it's a product, it's not a hazardous waste, but once you decide you don't want it, so I think those, like a lot of big box stores, are full of things that are going to be hazardous waste. They aren't at the time, but they become hazardous waste when they are discarded. And there's a whole section in the regulation of what it means to discard something, including keeping something for a long time and never getting around to using it actually is considered discarding under the regulatory framework. So probably already can guess why you would want to set up a system of regulations to control hazardous waste. And this is a cleanup after a fire of some ignitable waste. And again, on the speaker's notes, if you look at them, you'll see specifically what it is. This is a subdivision in New York State called Left Canal, and have you heard of it or not really? No? It came up in the 1970s. Essentially, this was an industrial waste dump during World War II time frame. They kind of capped it off, covered it with soil, and then somebody decided it would be a good place to build a subdivision of houses. And then at some point, some of the containers, the drums sort of breached, and stuff started kind of percolating out of the soil. People were getting bad smells. They were being exposed to really harmful chemicals. They ended up, it was tens of millions of dollars. The neighborhood had to be completely abandoned. And so this was an example of discarding hazardous waste without really planning for how it's going to be contained in the long term. And also land use. Like, you don't want to build, even a really well-run landfill is not a good place to build houses. So, yes, sir.
I know this gets more complicated because it's in the ocean, but I'm a marine transportation, so like the guys who drive the boats here, major, and a lot of us have been talking about some of like the discoveries of different like dump sites off of, like the Channel Islands in particular. There's a bunch of dumps of toxic chemicals, and is like Cal EPA involved in cleaning that up? I know it's more complicated because it's in the ocean and certain districts and whatnot, but I wondered how that's regulated and dealt with when we find it out after the fact when it wasn't illegal at the time. Like, who's responsible for cleaning?
I don't think so. There's something called the Ocean Protection Council, which is part of the Resources Agency. Professor Dudman actually might know. Do you know who regulates like offshore dumping? It probably depends. If you're outside of the territorial waters, then it might just be
federal.
Nobody, or federal, or
Oh, outside, it could be.
Yeah, but
There's
definitely.
a bunch off the Channel Islands that have been like discovered recently-ish.
And is it drums, or were they just dump?
Oh yeah.
Wow.
Like thousands of drums.
Wow.
Yeah.
I actually would like to know who's responsible for that.
They know which company they found it. Specifically off like San Clemente, there's like thousands of drums of toxic waste that was dumped. But it was totally legal at the time, so there's plenty of paperwork proving everything, but it was just totally legal. I was just wondering if Cal EPA was involved in the cleanup of that.
Don't think it could be under the State Water Board, but I don't think so. Actually,
Gotcha.
I don't think we do that.
Interesting.
The Stringfellow acid pits is another site. There were 35 million gallons of toxic chemicals discarded in an old quarry over like a 30-year period, and there were just unlined pits. So a normal hazardous waste landfill is like very engineered. There's double lining. The containers, there's secondary containment. So there's a lot of steps taken to prevent leaks and releases. Essentially, waste was dumped into unlined ponds, leached into the groundwater, leached into an adjacent creek, and this is a legacy site. It's going to take 400 years to clean up. That's why I wanted to pull up the speaker's notes, because I think that's kind of pretty dramatic.
That was done legally at the time?
It was before RECRA, so I'll talk about RECRA, but it might have been legal because we didn't really regulate hazardous waste disposal until the 1970s. So there's also a link if you're interested in any of these sites in the speaker's notes, since I think the slides are going to be posted.
Yep.
You can follow the link and read a little bit more about it. This is from the Press Enterprise, which is the newspaper in Riverside, Inland Empire, which is kind of in the vicinity of the Stringfellow acid pits. And if you don't mind, I'll keep it in the non-speaker's notes view here, because I wanted to tell you some of the details about the Hudson River, Fort Edward and Hudson Falls in New York. And on the Hudson River, which ultimately drains down right by Manhattan, New York City, kind of on the upper Hudson River, General Electric had an industrial plant, and they made capacitors that were used for large like electrical installations. And this is an off-specification product. So essentially, these PCBs were useful. They've turned out to be some of the most toxic chemicals known, but they were developed because they had really good electrical insulating properties, and they were used in these transformers and capacitors. So they dumped over 1 million gallons of PCBs into the river that were off spec, that weren't exactly what they were supposed to be. They contaminated a 200-mile stretch of the river, and the New York State oversaw the dredging to try to scoop it up. you can just see what a big mess it is to try to clean something up and how much easier it would be if you didn't have to do that, if you managed it properly in the first place, or better still, if you found a cleaner way to do whatever it is you're doing, like insulate electrical things without actually generating something toxic in the first place. So that concept's sort of called pollution prevention. So again, there's a link in here, so if you're interested, you can read about it a little more. Okay, no worky. Let's see what's up. I might have to change views again. So I'm going to keep it in this view so I can see the slide things for a minute. Exide is, the name may or may not ring a bell. They make car batteries, or they used to. And this facility is in Vernon, California, in the Los Angeles area. And for 35 years, they were recycling used car batteries there. So if you've ever replaced your own battery, or if you've had a car battery replaced, then they typically charge a deposit and they take it back and it's recycled and all this. So this should be the right place for a used battery to go. And car batteries are pounds of lead, 30 or 40 pounds of lead, which is a toxic metal, and they have sulfuric acid, which is the electrolyte. So essentially the way you recycle them is you melt them down. And this is where I was talking about the air quality management districts. So there were two agencies that were overseeing this facility. One of them was my department, Toxic Substances Control. The other was the Los Angeles Air Quality Management District, or South Coast it should be, I should say. So in 2013, there were some indications that some of the lead might have gotten outside the fence line of this facility. I don't want to show you that yet. And then subsequently, let's see, the facility declared bankruptcy. Then there were some more samples taken from people's yards, and it turned out that up to 10,000 residential properties were contaminated by lead that came out of the smokestack from this facility. And this is inner city neighborhood, Hispanic neighborhood. It's in the yards, it's in the dirt. Kids are playing in the dirt. Some kids, they call it a pica child. There's certain kids that just eat dirt. And so they're really highly exposed. So it's been a big and controversial mess because the agencies that were overseeing this still happened, even though we have the laws that I'm talking about. So there has been quite a lot of money allocated by the legislature to clean up the residential properties. I'm going to show you on the next slide how that's going. And one of the things this has really done is we now have in my department an Office of Environmental Equity, and the whole point of that is to prevent stuff like this from happening. We want to make sure that not just that people that are living in poor or environmental justice community, immigrant, minority communities are not disproportionately harmed. And so every program that we implement now, we do it with an eye to environmental justice. So that's one good thing that has come out of this really bad situation. Let me show you. So this is actually a slide from a year ago, and I think I can, so there's something called a Chisel, a California Human Health Screening Level, which is the threshold for human health concern in soil. So there's if the soil contains the contaminant below the Chisel, then you're going to have less than a 1 in a million lifetime cancer risk from that soil. So they were developed some time ago. They're not really regulatory. They're advisory. And so this red line represents the Chisel, and these bars are showing the number of parcels that were below the Chisel in the area in Vernon, 109, and the rest were above. So, and some of them were quite high. This is a clickable interactive map that shows the properties, which ones have been cleaned up. So if you're interested, you can poke around on this on your own. But this has been 10,000 residential properties. It's a big project, a multi-year project. So next I'm going to talk about CIRCLA, or the Superfund Law, which was enacted in 1980 and provides federal authority to respond to releases or threatened releases of hazardous substances that may endanger public health or the environment. So there's a multi-step process, and ultimately, first the preliminary assessment and site inspection is just to kind of figure out what kind of contamination might be on this site. So there's a suspect site. They'll do a document review. They'll go visit the site and just kind of to see what kind of activities happened there, what kinds of chemicals and materials did they use that might have been released, stuff like that. The remedial investigation and risk assessment is to kind of figure out what is the sort of risk of this situation, of this contamination, and what can we do to mitigate that? So then that's the next step, the feasibility study step. Finally, there's a detailed plan drawn up. They design how to implement the plan. The site's remediated. It could be, depending on the nature of contamination, scooping and hauling the soil away. It could be pumping out groundwater or pumping chemicals from a plume. At some point, it's considered complete, cleaned up, and then there's ongoing monitoring to make sure that things haven't changed. Sometimes when there's a contaminated site under this process, you never get it truly clean. So sometimes it'll be clean enough for certain types of uses. For example, if you've been to IKEA in Emeryville, that is a brownfield site. That's a contaminated site. And it was cleaned up to commercial. It's clean enough for commercial, but not residential. They couldn't build houses there, but they could put an IKEA there, and it's okay. Because there's a paved parking lot, there's not going to be kids probably eating the dirt, things like that. So it's not ideal. There's a process, it's a good process, but you really don't want to go there. So that's just a super nutshell, and it's probably in your textbook a little more about CIRCLA, and it's pretty complicated. It's not my expertise, but just wanted to talk a little bit about it.
We talked about CIRCLA this week.
Okay, so you'll be digging into this a little bit more in detail. So RCRA, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, was enacted in 1976 and amended 8 years later in 1984. And then I also listed California's Hazardous Waste Control Law. And the reason why I put them both on the same slide is that we have RCRA authorization in California. So EPA essentially gives us a pot of money to implement the law for them. They've determined that our hazardous waste law is substantially equivalent, no less rigorous than RCRA. So when you look at our regulations and the federal RCRA regulations side by side, they're almost word for word. We have some areas where we go beyond what the federal regulations do, but they're all kind of numbered the same, use the same kind of wording, things like that. So some of the big concepts of RCRA and our hazardous waste control law are cradle to grave tracking. So this is one of the ways around that problem of waste being something people don't want to be careful with, they want to get rid of. Essentially, there's so if you're generating hazardous waste, you're required to. I don't want to get ahead because I have it on my next slides. But let me just say that under the framework, there are sort of three categories of people. There are generators; those are the people who produce hazardous waste through probably doing something else. They might be a dry cleaner, they might be a plating shop, they might be an industrial facility, they could be a car wash, it could be any kind of thing where hazardous waste is produced sort of as part of that business. Then there are people that transport that hazardous waste somewhere else. And so those people are regulated too, in a different set of rules. And then that somewhere else, which is called a treatment, storage, or disposal facility, they're the most stringently regulated. So essentially you have generators, transporters, and TSDFs, and I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those. So in general, when somebody generates a waste, so it could be, oh, this is an off-specification product, I can't sell it. They just generated waste. Or I've had this can of Raid for 5 years and I'm not going to use it, generated a waste. Or I damaged this thing, or I don't know, I broke a bottle and I have to scoop up the mess of this toxic chemical, generated waste. So you produce a waste, and then the regulations say you have to do a hazardous waste determination. So this is the first requirement for a hazardous waste generator, or a generator of a waste. I shouldn't say hazardous waste generator. Is this a hazardous waste, or is this just waste or solid waste? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how you make that determination. So we're not, as households and consumers, we're probably going to use, we're probably just going to use our knowledge. It'll probably say, dispose of in accordance with local laws or something. But in an industrial facility, they may need to do chemical testing, or they may need to understand their process enough to know what the nature of the material they're producing is. And so there's really two buckets of ways to be a hazardous waste. One is to be a listed waste, and I'll talk about what those lists are, what that's about. The other is a characteristic hazardous waste. So the generator has to do the determination, and then if they determine they have a hazardous waste, they're subject to all the rules that apply to a hazardous waste generator. And the first rule is getting an ID number. So this is part of the big brother of hazardous waste cradle to grave tracking. You apply for a number that says, here's my name, here's my address, and I generate hazardous waste. And that number is used on your manifest, which is the transportation document that accompanies the waste when you relinquish it to the transporter. So the hazardous waste manifest used to be a multi-carbon piece of paper. There's now an electronic version. But when you're shipping hazardous waste, you have liability for it. So your name is on it. There's a label. If it ends up illegally disposed, causes a mess, the liability comes back to you. So therefore, people that generate hazardous waste have to be careful about whom they hire to handle their waste. If they're going to have it trucked, they probably want to make sure that it's a reputable company, they're registered, et cetera, that it's going to an appropriate facility. If they don't get the manifest copy back, you're supposed to receive documentation. Yes, the waste was received where I sent it. If you don't get that, you're supposed to report it, things like that. So a hazardous waste generator can't just send hazardous waste anywhere. If you want to accept hazardous waste from somebody else, you have to have a permit. And as I mentioned, that's not a piece of paper. That is potentially binders and binders. So what's the hazardous waste determination? So I kind of talked a little bit about it. First, is it a waste? And that's defined. Discarded material, off specification, a sludge. There are a number of different types of things that can be make something a waste. Speculative accumulation means I'm going to get rid of it someday, so I don't really want it. That can make it a waste too. It's sort of in your mind when you generate a hazardous waste, or when you generate a waste. So secondly, then if you're a facility and you generate the waste, you have to ask yourself, is this excluded? Like, well, I make semiconductors in Silicon Valley. Yes, it contains a hazardous solvent, but I'm going to give it to the auto repair facility down the street, and they're going to use it to clean parts. That's excluded. Recycling is not regulated. So there's a lot of exemptions and exclusions that are designed to try to beneficially recycle things that otherwise would be hazardous waste, for example. So the next step is, if it's not excluded or exempted, does it appear on any of these hazardous waste lists that I'm going to tell you about? If not, finally, you have to ask, does this waste exhibit a characteristic? So you can see it's complicated, and that's what those people that I mentioned in the hazardous waste regulatory program do, is sort of answer questions usually the hard ones, I'm recycling it in this way. Is it excluded? Or, we'll get into the details of it. So, in the RCRA regulations, I have a citation, Title 40 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 261, is where you find these lists. And so certain industries will just know the F list is lists that comes from a particular type of industry, like electro winnowing or plating. There are all these very specific types of industrial processes that are named there. Spent halogenated solvents is an example. Acute hazardous wastes are on the P list. That could be like it's a pure product that is that you don't want. So it's not a mixture. It doesn't contain warfarin. It's just like a bottle of warfarin, which is rat poison. That would be a P001 waste. So I misspoke. The F wastes are more general, like methylene chloride. The K lists are the ones that cite the really specific industrial process, like plating or whatnot. U list, discarded commercial chemical products, example acetaldehyde. So each of these lists, basically, there's a narrative, little description, what it is. If the thing you want to get rid of is on the list, you've got a hazardous waste. You've already determined it's not excluded. You've got to manage it according to the rules I'm going to talk about. In California, we have another list we call the M list, discarded mercury-containing products. We have, as we talked about, a mercury problem in California, so we have added these items that include fluorescent light tubes, mercury switches that are found in maybe tilt switches in the trunk that turn the light on in a car, things like that. Dental fillings for people old enough to have mercury fillings when they grind them out. That's actually a listed waste. So what that means is it doesn't matter what the concentration is. If it meets the description, it has to be managed as hazardous waste. So that's the concept. There's lists. If it's on the list, you got a hazardous waste. Then there are the 4 characteristics. So if you have a waste, it doesn't appear on any of those 4 lists or 5 lists, you still have to, you're not done, you still have to ask yourself, does this waste exhibit a characteristic? And the 4 are ignitability, reactivity, corrosivity, and toxicity. And so this slide kind of talks about how those are defined. So the ignitability characteristic is based on flash point. The reactivity is a narrative standard. It's sort of chemicals that ignite or create poisonous vapors when mixed with other products or explode. This one is sort of, there isn't like a test method or a specific characteristic. It's like if something exploded, then yeah, you had an ignitable waste, reactive waste, and you didn't manage it properly. So it's sort of retrospectively applied, and maybe there'll be action taken against you. Corrosivity, based on the pH, either very high or very low pH. And toxicity is the most complicated, can cause long-term illness or death. There's some examples. So just a little more about the ignitability characteristic. And I don't need to read that. Again, the corrosivity characteristic is, there are a couple of elements to that. One is measuring the pH, or mixing it with water and measuring the pH, or if it corrodes steel, either if it's a liquid by itself or if you mix it with water. So a lot of times people are going to use knowledge. They're going to know they're using a strong acid or a strong base. They're not going to do a steel corrosion test likely. They'll probably know, and they'll probably be on the conservative side and say, yes, yeah, I'm pretty sure. So, but you can send it to a lab and have them tell you, are you above the line or below the line? And then finally, reactivity, as I mentioned, this one is a narrative criteria. There's not a test method. You just have to use your best judgment, and if something goes wrong, then you can tell that you called it wrong. Like if something explodes, then due to the way you handled it, then you probably didn't classify it and manage it properly. So kind of a takeaway is a lot of these regulatory things are based on thresholds. There's a line that somebody will draw, and that's where I was talking earlier about science applied to regulation. So it may be that something is really just above the line and it can go in the trash, and just below the line it has to be managed under these really stringent controls. And that is, sometimes people would you might have an absurd situation based on that. But it's trying to be protective, so it's probably a conservative way of doing it. So then that brings us to the final of the 4 characteristics of a hazardous waste, which is toxicity. And the main kind of elements of the toxicity characteristic are 2 tests. One is called the TCLP, which is called, in the RECRA regs, it's the Toxicity Characteristic Leaching Procedure. And it's designed to mimic what happens in a landfill, like a garbage landfill. So essentially, you mix up a solution of a weak acid, and then you put a sample of waste in, and you put it in a shaker and agitate it for 48 hours or something, and then you filter out the liquid and you analyze it. So if you detect one of the chemicals there's a threshold for in the liquid, that means it's leachable. So that means that if it were disposed of, your waste wasn't put in a landfill, it's likely that that toxic chemical would also be leached out and potentially contaminate groundwater or surface water. That's the general rationale. So we also have 2 other thresholds in California, the total threshold limit concentration. So there are certain chemicals that if your waste contains the total concentration above the limit, it's a hazardous waste, even if it's not leachable. So that's a California only thing. And we have a different test that mimics a landfill called the soluble threshold limit concentration. It uses a different acid solution, so it's very analogous but different. And again, there are a set of thresholds for that. And then these other ones are the next 4, acute oral, acute dermal, acute inhalation, and acute aquatic, are actually determined using animals. They're animal test methods. So in acute oral, unfortunately, the way they determine that is if you sort of force feed the stuff to an animal, if the amount, so milligrams of the substance per kilogram body weight. So if you have a lab rat that weighs 200 grams, so that would be 1/5 of 2,500, 500 milligrams of whatever it is kills that rat, then that is, or less, then that means it's acutely toxic. Similarly, acute dermal, LD, lethal dose 50. That means it kills half. That acute dermal means applied to the skin. Acute inhalation means it's in the air that the animal's breathing. Acute aquatic LC50 is done with certain species of fish or water fleas where you put a concentration in the water and count the dead organisms. So basically, this is the kind of the gruesome part of the toxicity characteristic.
Are those tested almost exclusively with rats and mice?
There's rats, mice. They specify the species in the test method, but typically, usually you're probably going to find out you have hazardous waste other ways. But yeah, typically they do specify exactly what species to use.
Yeah.
Then there's also a list of if it contains certain carcinogens at 0.001% or more, that also makes it exhibit toxicity, and therefore it's hazardous waste. So that's a lot of complicated things, but basically, to sum up, before I get to the requirements, so you kind of have, it's a decision tree. Okay, I have something. Is it a waste? Do I want to get rid of it? Is it spent? Is it off specification? Is it a sludge? Yes, no. Yes, okay, I've got a waste. Is it excluded from regulation? Like, am I going to recycle it in a certain way that makes it not regulated? Yes, no. No? Okay. Does it appear on any of these 5 lists? If it does, got a hazardous waste. If you don't, does it exhibit any of these 4 characteristics? Ignitability, reactivity, corrosivity? No? Okay, what about toxicity? Then you have to answer all these things. Is the TCLP, when you do the leaching test, above or below the limit? Above, it's hazardous waste. Below, not. Or maybe not. Maybe you still haven't done because you have to go through these total threshold limit concentration, STLC, all these acute oral and inhalation, and the carcinogens. So it's complicated, but for most people that are involved like in a commercial or industrial activity that produces the waste, they pretty much know, especially if what they're doing is fairly routine. If you run dry cleaner, you know perchloroethylene is hazardous waste, so you don't need to do any animal testing. You don't really need to send it to a lab. You just know. So there's a practical side. So just give you a quick overview, and let's check the time here, 8:30, of hazardous waste transporter requirements. So there are some general rules for transporting hazardous materials. So the people that transport hazardous waste are sort of a special breed of transporters. So you'll see trucks around that say things like Safety Clean. They're a hazardous waste transporter. You'll see them around. Evergreen. There's some other ones. And their whole business is taking hazardous waste, typically from the generator, to a facility. So they need to follow the DOT rules, which are those diamond-shaped placards. You'll see, sometimes you'll see vertical lines, or reds, or flames, or skulls. There's all kinds of symbols. There are numbers. So all of that is just to alert. A lot of it's for emergency responders. If there's an accident or a spill, emergency responders can respond safely and do the right thing. There's the manifest, which I mentioned earlier, which is that kind of record that follows the hazardous waste from the generator to the transporter to the destination and then comes back to the generator. So the transporter has to use that. They have to have the ID number, just like the generator, so they're registered. And in California, there's an additional registration requirement in addition to getting the ID number. So you have to have a special, I don't know if it's a license technically, but some kind of authorization. And then finally, the destinations facility or treatment, storage, and disposal facility. This is the kind of highest risk activity. These people are handling hazardous waste as their core business. They're likely to have a lot of it. They're likely to have a lot of different kinds potentially. So the permit is the first requirement, which includes, as I mentioned, things like site plans, chemical inventories, engineering drawings, secondary containment for tanks and containers. So if something fails, that it just doesn't release. They have to have liability insurance to cover third parties if there's a release and it contaminates somebody's property. They have to develop a detailed plan for if and when they go out of business. How are they going to close and clean up? Where is all the stuff going to go? How's it going to be managed? How much will it cost to implement the closure plan? They have to do a closure cost estimate that aligns with what they've actually put in the plan. And then they have to have a mechanism to pay for it. So if they were to go bankrupt or out of business, is there money in the bank or an insurance policy or something that will cover the closure costs? So all those things, it's a high hurdle to get a hazardous waste permit. Yeah.
Are these facilities usually more like out of rural areas, or are they, like, especially in LA?
There are some. They tend to be in environmental justice communities, like Kettleman City. If you've ever driven down I-5, Kettleman City is the largest Kettleman Hills landfill, the largest landfill west of the Mississippi. And yeah, they tend to be in remoter areas. There's a Clean Harbors facility in Southern California too. But yeah, it tends to be not something you're going to put in Marin County or somewhere where the property value is real high. So therefore, there's the risk of exposing vulnerable communities. So that's one of the big problems. In fact, the people that live in Kettleman Hills, Kettleman City, have a lot of risk factors. They're exposed to chemicals because a lot of them work in agriculture. They're on the highway. There are a lot of trucks from the ag that are spewing diesel exhaust. It was a oil field prior to, I think it's played out, but there's oil drilling waste around. So there are all kinds of risk factors that those people face. So when the trouble is, when that facility was full, that Chem Waste Management that runs it wanted to expand the facility, so that meant getting a new permit. Getting a hazardous waste permit, I didn't mention, but it requires public notice and public comment. You have to have public hearings. And the people in the community were like, we don't need any more of your shit coming here. This is not what we want, but deny the permit. And it's hard to say, well, trust us. We're with the government. We did the calculations. Our engineers designed it. It's safe. It may be true, but if you're living in that community, it's not very reassuring necessarily. So it's not perfect. It's better if we don't produce hazardous waste, but that's a real issue.
What did Ronald Reagan say? It's like the 8 scariest words in the human
I'll
language.
For the government.
I'm with the government.
I'm with the government. I'm here to help. So, I kind of talked a bit about cradle to grave and the tracking of hazardous waste and whatnot. And I'm with the government, and I'm here to help. Help you learn. There are exemptions and exclusion. So some, as I kind of alluded to a couple times, there are certain types of recycling that basically say if you're using it, if you're recycling without reclaiming, if you don't do something to it before you recycle it, hazardous waste, it's true recycling, it's excluded, for example. There are certain exemptions, and there is a group of people who are employed trying to figure out these exemptions. It's very complicated. This is in statute, not regulation. This was adopted by the California legislature in, 1526. I've forgotten the numbers now. I used to know the chapter and verse for it. Then there are certain hazardous wastes that are eligible for alternative management standards, and I think I have a few slides about those. I don't, but I mentioned already fluorescent light tubes, mercury waste, those mercury-containing things, spent batteries are exempt from cradle-to-grave tracking, manifesting. You don't need a registered transporter. The idea is that those rules are really intended for an industrial facility or commercial facility, not for a household or a small business. So it's actually probably better to have a little slacker set of rules. It's probably more likely people can follow them. So alternative management standards. So I kind of touched on some of the differences between California and RCRA. They're very similar. As I mentioned, the numbering lines up. The wording is often identical. We have corrosivity characteristics for solids in California that's not in RCRA. I mentioned we have the total threshold limit concentration. Yes?
I do have a question for you. When I talk about state versus federal differences, maybe I'm exaggerating, but I tend to say California tends to be stricter. Is that not? It sounds like you're saying it's pretty much the same.
Well, I think it is. So stricter in some sense. I think we capture things that aren't captured under the federal system. For example,
would you say it's 5% different or 80% different?
I'd say it's 5% different.
Okay, so yeah.
But maybe it's 10. For example, under I mentioned exclusions and exemptions. A small business that generates a small amount of hazardous waste under the RCRA regulations, that waste is exempt from management as hazardous waste, so they can pitch it in the trash, even if it's a chemical waste. But it's only for a small business, like maybe it's a retail store or a restaurant or something. In California, we don't have that. Household waste is just considered solid waste, no matter what it is. A can of Raid, if you're in any of the other 49 states, you can just pitch it in the trash. But it's not exempted in California.
So we can't put Raid in the trash?
No.
Wait, where are you supposed to put it?
Aha, you have to take it to your county or city household hazardous waste collection facility.
Batteries too.
Batteries, you can take them to like Home Depot or somewhere, or you can take them over to the Superfund site at IKEA and they'll take them. I mean the brownfield site. Paints, pesticides, a lot of household products are technically hazardous waste. They're technically, it's not allowed. I mean, it's not allowed to drive 70 on I-80 either. I'm not condoning it, but for me, as a regulator, I can't not do the right thing because I would be the biggest hypocrite in the world. So what I do then is if I'm buying something, I'm like, do I even want to buy this? Because I don't want to have to get rid of it, honestly. So that's really kind of like my personal pollution prevention plan, which is if I have to take it somewhere, I'm not going to buy it if I don't have to.
Do you think we could do better with the collection facilities as to making them more accessible?
I think so. I think they're underfunded, and I think making the manufacturers fund them might be a good way, the people would put the products in commerce. That's where that extended producer responsibility idea comes in, where it's like, it's sort of like, here's some Raid. Okay, I'm done. It's not my problem anymore. Well, if the, then it's a little political, but if I might think a little bit more if I'm going to have to deal with it at end of life. Do I really want to sell this? Maybe I can find another way to, maybe I'll sell fly swatters or something. What's that?
Or up the price.
Or just up the price. Yeah. So normally the idea with EPR is you embed the price. So a lot of times they'll say don't put a visible fee. Sometimes you'll buy paint or a mattress and there'll be an extra fee on it, saying this is a recycling fee. And it's the same thing you pay either way. But so again, yeah, there's some so we capture more things and we exclude fewer things. So maybe it's 5, maybe it's 10%. And then lastly, before we take a break, what time's class over?
9:30.
9:30. We'll get you out before 9:30. Lastly, Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA. This was adopted in 1976 and was essentially considered more or less a failure. It's been revamped as of 2017, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So, under TSCA, the chemicals that were already in commerce in the United States, meaning they were already being used to make products or as ingredients or whatever, were presumed to be safe and grandfathered in. So there was no risk assessment required or safety assessment. And the burden of proof was on the federal EPA to find that there was an unreasonable risk. And they also had to think about cost-benefit analysis before they could impose a restriction. So it's like, if you think about it, it's like, is this safe? Well, no, but it's expensive, so never mind. That kind of a thing to change it. So, and then there was also a requirement that they impose the least burdensome restriction. So basically, I think there was just very few chemicals that were evaluated under the Toxic Substances Control Act between 1976 until pretty recently. So in 2017, Lautenberg Amendment, so Frank Lautenberg was a congressman from New York State, passed away. He was a champion for reforming this law, and so they named the reformed TSCA after him, the Lautenberg Act. So there's now a risk-based safety standard. They've taken away the least burdensome requirement, and EPA was told they had to publish a list of 10 chemicals and initiate risk evaluation. Then they've done that. There's 10, and there's another list of 10. So there's a lot more action going on. And some of the chemicals that I'm going to tell you about after the break that we're looking at, actually EPA has put in their risk evaluation that preempts us. So under the previous iteration of TSCA, manufacturers had to submit a notification before they started manufacturing a new chemical. EPA had to determine there was an unreasonable risk within 90 days, otherwise it was a pass. So if the clock ran out, then it's a go. Now EPA has to make an affirmative finding that unreasonable risk is unlikely before the chemical can go on the market. So it's much more precautionary and protective than the older version. This is the preemption thing. A state, so there's an interest in having kind of uniform chemical safety laws in all of the states. So essentially, once EPA initiates a risk evaluation, then states can't take action on the same chemical for the same hazards. So let's see, but I think it has to be a high priority chemical. So we just had a talk on this at work. We had somebody from federal EPA give us the scoop on this. So there are so essentially there are certain chemicals we've been looking at. One of them is a chemical called methylene chloride, which has been used in paint stripping. And there's a lot of toxicity data for it. It's acutely toxic. It's an inhalation hazard, and it also causes cancer. And so we actually initiated regulation of paint strippers with methylene chloride. EPA started risk evaluation, and that basically just kind of pulled the carpet out from under us, and we essentially stopped work on that. And methylpyrrolidone is another one. Prop 65 is just an information right to know law, so that's not preempted by TSCA Lautenberg. So that was like a super nutshell. I didn't even really cover that in any good detail, but basically we're really lagging in the United States on our overall chemicals law. And the European Union, for example, they have something called the REACH directive, which applies in all the member states of the European Union. And all the chemicals that are in commerce have to be registered. So REACH stands for registration, evaluation, and authorization of chemicals. So you have to, as a manufacturer, you have to send your registration application to the European Chemicals Agency, which is in Finland. And then they may impose some restrictions on its use and things like that. So basically, all those 10,000 chemicals, 60,000 chemicals that have been grandfathered in under TSCA, they don't really have that under Europe. Even if something's been used for decades, it still has to undergo REACH authorization to continue to be put into the market. And so that really is reducing the use of the worst, and it's kind of mitigating the need for places like hazardous waste landfills. I mean, there's still a lot of nasty chemicals in commerce in the European Union, but that's sort of like the holy grail for chemicals regulation. Similar, Canada has a fairly progressive chemical safety law, and some other chemicals. China actually has a pretty good China REACH law. So, but this new TSCA is definitely much more protective than what we had before, and they're working their way through 10 chemicals at a time. And essentially, if they find an unreasonable risk, then things end up being taken out of the market. So that's already happening with paint strippers and some other things. With the change of administrations, some of the risk evaluations that they did, where they found there was no risk, they're saying, actually, maybe there is, and they're redoing them now. So it's a little bit in flux. One of those is a chemical called 1,4-dioxane that I'll talk about a little bit after the break.